Jax Terrell stood at the edge of the observation platform, his eyes scanning the horizon of the alien planet below. He had only been on the world for a few hours, but already it felt like an eternity. The green sky above was fractured with streaks of violet clouds, and the two suns in the sky were just beginning to set, casting long shadows over the barren landscape. He had never been this far from Earth before, and although his stomach churned with the unease of being so far from home, there was something exhilarating about it. He was a pioneer. An explorer. The first human to step foot on this strange world. His mission, however, was less about exploration and more about survival. The Galactic Coalition had sent him here to retrieve valuable resources from a mining outpost on the surface, but what they hadn't told him, what they had never told anyone, was that the planet, Ardenus IV, had a dark secret. The outpost had gone silent 2 months ago. No communication, no distress signals. The last thing anyone had heard from the team there was a cryptic message that mentioned something about the hunters. "Jax, do you copy?" The voice crackled over his earpiece, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Captain Lyra's voice, sharp and commanding, as always. "Copy," Jax replied, his voice steady but his nerves tingling at the mention of those two words. Hunters. He'd heard rumors about them, the mysterious creatures that had driven the mining crew to silence. But rumors didn't do justice to the terror that followed the mention of that name. "We've got a report from the ground team," Lyra continued. "We think the crew might be compromised. We're sending you in to check it out. Don't engage unless you have to." Jack sighed and ran a hand through his short-cropped hair. "Understood. I'll report back in an hour." "Be careful," Lyra added, her tone softening for just a moment. "We're counting on you." The communication cut off, and Jax stood alone on the platform, a sudden weight settling on his shoulders. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. The dropship that had brought him to the surface was already lifting off, its engines roaring as it ascended back to orbit. He was alone now, surrounded only by the eerie silence of Ardenus IV. The mining facility he needed to investigate was several kilometers away, nestled in the shadow of a jagged mountain range. The atmosphere was thin here, making the air feel sharp and brittle in his lungs. He adjusted his suit's life support system and began his trek toward the outpost, the sound of his boots crunching on the rocky ground the only noise accompanying him. The further he walked, the more his mind raced. What exactly had happened to the crew? He'd read the preliminary reports, but they didn't explain much. Something about an ancient predator species, an alien race with a reputation for stalking their prey across entire planets. And then, of course, there was the cryptic warning about the hunters. The outpost's final transmission had been cut off mid-sentence, leaving no trace of what the team had encountered. It was like they had simply vanished into thin air. By the time Jax reached the mining complex, the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long, eerie shadows over the barren landscape. The facility was a crumbling structure, barely standing in the harsh environment. The walls were pocked with craters, as though they had been bombarded by something, perhaps meteors or some other natural force. But Jax didn't believe in coincidences, and the signs pointed to something more deliberate. He stepped through the main entrance, the door groaning in protest as it slid open. Inside, the air was stale, and the dim lighting flickered above him. His boots echoed through the hallway as he moved cautiously forward, his senses heightened. Every door he passed was closed tight, the rooms within shrouded in darkness. No signs of life, no signs of anything, really, just the strange emptiness of a place abandoned in haste. "Hello?" Jax called out, his voice unnervingly loud in the silence. "Is anyone here?" "Nothing." He pushed forward, deeper into the complex, and made his way to the central control room. The door opened with a soft hiss, and he stepped inside. The room was a mess. Papers were scattered across the floor, and the monitors were either cracked or dead. But what caught his attention was the thick smell of something rotten in the air. It was almost metallic, like blood, but not quite. He could feel his heart rate pick up as he approached the central console. It was then that he saw the first sign that something was terribly wrong. blood, smeared across the console, as if someone had been desperately trying to write something or send a message before it was too late. But whatever had been written was barely legible, just a few jagged strokes, like someone had been interrupted. There were no signs of struggle. No bodies. No movement. Jack swallowed hard. This wasn't just a missing crew anymore. Something had happened here. Something he wasn't ready for. A sudden noise behind him made him spin around, his hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm holstered at his waist. But there was nothing there. Just the faintest sound of scurrying feet, as though something small and fast was moving through the vents above him. He took a cautious step backward, his senses on high alert. The air felt thicker now, heavier. Like something was closing in on him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and the instinctual feeling that he was being watched made his pulse spike. He quickly backed out of the control room and retraced his steps, trying to maintain his composure. He had to think logically. Someone, was out there, and he needed to figure out what before he became the next victim. His comm unit crackled to life again, the voice of Captain Lyra cutting through the tension. "Jax, what's your status? Do you have eyes on the crew?" His voice was steady when he replied, but it was a fight to keep the tremor out of it. "Negative, Captain. No sign of life, but I'm getting a bad feeling about this. Stay sharp, Jax. We're sending reinforcements. Don't engage unless absolutely necessary." "Understood," Jax said, his eyes scanning the hallway ahead of him. "I'll keep looking around." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every creak and groan of the building seemed amplified, every flicker of light a warning. Jax gritted his teeth and pushed forward, determined to get answers, no matter the cost. The next room he entered was the mess hall, and that was when he saw it. The remains of what appeared to be the last meal of the crew, scattered across the tables. The food was untouched, but there were signs of a hurried evacuation. A chair had been overturned, a cup shattered on the floor, and there, just behind the counter, an odd collection of tools, some stained with a dark substance that made Jax's stomach churn. What had happened here? As he reached for one of the tools, the light above him flickered one last time, and then everything went dark. The hum of the emergency lights was the only sound in the room, and Jax's heart raced as the familiar voice of Captain Lyra crackled in his ear again. "Jax, what's going on down there? Talk to me." Jax's voice was low, filled with unease. "I don't know, Captain. But I think I'm not alone down here." Jax's breath caught in his throat as the emergency lights bathed the mess hall in an eerie red glow. The room was a sea of shadows, and the sudden isolation was suffocating. His comm unit buzzed in his ear, the voice of Captain Lyra calling out to him, but it felt distant, as though she were speaking from another world entirely. "Jax, do you copy? Respond." Lyra's voice snapped through the static. He pressed his hand against his earpiece, his heart pounding, but the words he'd been about to speak got stuck in his throat. The air had thickened in the room, the oppressive weight of something unseen pressing down on him. He strained his eyes, trying to peer into the dark corners of the mess hall, but there was nothing except the unsettling feeling of being watched. His fingers found the weapon holstered at his side, the cold steel of his sidearm providing a momentary sense of security. It was just a precaution, of course. Nothing had happened yet. "Jax, what the hell is going on down there?" Lyra's voice again, more insistent this time. Jax began, but his voice faltered as something flickered in his peripheral vision. At first, it was just a movement, too fast for him to identify. He spun toward it, weapon raised, but there was nothing in the shadows, nothing except the faintest echo of a whispering breeze, as if the very walls were sighing. A rustle. Then a loud crash. The sound came from the direction of the supply closet near the back of the room. Jax's pulse quickened. Something was definitely here. Something that didn't belong. He took slow, careful steps toward the source of the noise, his fingers tightening around the grip of his sidearm. The mess hall was far too quiet now, the silence stretching until it was unbearable. His boots made no sound on the floor as he moved, his eyes scanning every shadow. Another crash. This time it was louder, more forceful. Jax moved faster, his hand on the edge of the doorframe leading to the supply closet, his breath shallow. He didn't want to check, didn't want to see what was behind that door, but there was no choice now. If the crew had met something hostile down here, he needed to know what he was dealing with. Before he could push the door open, a strange, guttural sound filled the room. Low. Deep. Almost animalistic. It was followed by the unmistakable noise of someone, scraping against metal. His heart skipped a beat. A shiver ran down his spine. Then, before he could react, the door to the supply closet burst open, and a figure lunged at him from the darkness. Jax barely had time to react. His instincts kicked in, and he fired twice, the shots ringing out in the enclosed space of the mess hall. The figure collapsed in a heap at his feet, its body twitching in the dim light. Jax froze, his gun still raised, staring down at what had once been a man, what had once been one of the missing crew members. But now, there was nothing human about it. Its body was twisted and deformed, its skin an unnatural shade of grayish-green, almost translucent. Its eyes were wide and empty, like dark voids, and its mouth was open in a twisted grimace. There was something undeniably wrong with it, something utterly alien. He lowered his gun, though his heart was still pounding in his chest, and crouched down to get a closer look. As he knelt beside the body, his mind raced, trying to process the scene. Had this been one of the crew members? Or had it been something else, something that had taken control of their bodies? The stench of decay was overwhelming now, and Jax could see that the body had been drained of most of its blood. The flesh was taut against its bones, as though it had been preserved by some strange force. Whatever had happened to this person, it was no longer human. "Captain." Jax whispered into the comm, his voice trembling. "I found one of them. But it's not human. It's something else. Something worse." There was a long pause before Lyra's voice came back, more frantic now. "Jax, I need you to get out of there. This is bigger than we thought. We're sending in reinforcements." "No," Jax interrupted, his voice sharp. "I need to know what's going on here. I need to understand how this happened." The air felt colder now. The mess hall was silent once again, but Jax could feel the weight of something watching him, just out of sight. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He stood up slowly, keeping his gun trained on the body, as though the very presence of the creature might rise again at any moment. And then, just as he was about to step away, another sound echoed through the building, a faint scuttling noise. It was coming from the ventilation shafts. His eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. The sound was growing louder, closer, more frenzied. "Captain," he said, his voice low, the fear creeping in now. "Something's in the vents. We need to." The sound of a heavy thud, followed by another, made him spin around. His eyes locked on the ceiling, and he saw them, dozens of shapes darting through the shadows in the vents, their eyes glinting with an unholy light. The creatures were everywhere now, moving faster than he could follow. In the blink of an eye, Jax was running. His boots pounded against the floor as he sprinted back through the hall, his mind racing with the realization of what he was facing. This wasn't just a group of rogue miners or a malfunctioning outpost. These creatures, these hunters, had been waiting. Waiting for him. Waiting for anyone who came to investigate. The clattering of claws on metal echoed in the distance as the creatures moved, their speed increasing. Jax's pulse surged, his body moving on instinct. He didn't know how much time he had before they overwhelmed him. He reached the elevator shaft and slammed his palm against the control panel, praying that it would still work. The door slid open, and Jax stumbled inside, not pausing to check if anything was following him. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his heart pounded in his chest like a drumbeat. The elevator began to rise, its hum vibrating through the floor, but as the seconds ticked by, a sickening realization began to creep over him. The creatures weren't just in the building. They were everywhere. And now, he was trapped. His comm crackled again, and this time, it wasn't Lyra's voice. It was a new one. A distorted, alien tone. "You're not getting out, Jax. Welcome to our world." The transmission cut out. Jax's grip tightened on his weapon. This was no longer about survival. It was about escape. Jax's breath came in ragged bursts as the elevator shot upward, its mechanical groans only amplifying the pounding of his heart. The flickering emergency lights in the shaft cast long, jagged shadows across the walls. He slammed his fist against the control panel, praying for it to go faster. But it didn't. The elevator moved at a crawl, taking its time as the sound of scratching, scraping claws echoed from the lower levels. He could feel them. The hunters. Their presence was like a cold draft that swept across his skin, a sensation so primal, so deeply embedded in his survival instincts that it felt like his every pore was attuned to their approach. The voice on the comm had been clear. "Welcome to our world." What did that mean? Was it a warning? A taunt? Jax couldn't afford to think about it too much. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as another claw scraped against the elevator shaft's metal walls, a sound so sharp it made his teeth ache. They were closing in. A quick glance at the control panel revealed that the elevator would be at the surface in another minute. A minute was an eternity when death was waiting just below. His hands trembled as he gripped the weapon tighter. He didn't even know if he would make it to the surface. What was he supposed to do? How could he fight something like this? He had no idea what kind of creatures these hunters were, but everything about them screamed danger. And the worst part? He hadn't even begun to understand how they worked, what they were capable of. The miners who had gone silent hadn't left any useful records, nothing to prepare him for the enemy he now faced. "Think, Jax," he urged himself. "You've got this. Stay calm." The elevator gave a sudden jolt, causing him to stumble. He quickly steadied himself, heart racing, eyes darting around the space. The elevator shook again, the sound of claws scraping against metal growing louder, nearer. His legs tensed, ready to sprint the moment the door opened. Another few seconds. The walls trembled with each strike. The hunters were fast, relentless. The kind of predators whose very existence was built on tracking, hunting, and killing. The hum of the elevator came to a screeching halt as it finally reached the surface. The doors opened with a deafening clang, revealing the bleak expanse of Ardenus IV's alien landscape. The moment he stepped out, Jax could taste the acrid dust in the air, the thick atmosphere pressing against his chest. But it wasn't just the harsh environment that made him feel trapped. It was the sense that something was lurking out there, watching. "Captain, I'm at the surface," Jax hissed into his comm unit, his voice tight with urgency. "I'm in the open. There's no way out, Lyra. We're dealing with something I've never seen before." A brief pause on the other end, then Lyra's voice, filled with barely contained concern. "Jax, hold on. We're sending reinforcements. Just stay there and wait for backup." Jax gritted his teeth. Reinforcements? At this point, they'd be too late. He'd seen enough already to know what was happening here. And there was no time to waste. "Forget the reinforcements," Jax snapped. "I need to figure out a way to stop these things now." Before Lyra could respond, a distant, terrifying howl sliced through the air. It was primal, guttural, and chilling, a sound that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. Something in the distance had heard him. Jax's hand hovered over the sidearm at his hip, his mind racing. He had to make a decision. Fast. He had seen the way the creatures moved, swift, almost fluid, like a predator stalking its prey. It wasn't enough to just run, he needed a plan to outsmart them. He wasn't just a soldier, he was an explorer. A thinker. And he'd faced impossible odds before. His gaze shifted toward the remains of the mining outpost. The structure was a shattered skeleton of steel and concrete, crumbling from years of neglect. Its exterior had been damaged, battered by whatever had come for the miners. But there were still resources inside. tools, equipment, anything that could help him hold his ground. He turned and sprinted back toward the building, his boots crunching on the uneven terrain. His thoughts were focused. If he could just get to the control center, there had to be something, anything, that could give him an edge. The sound of footsteps behind him, heavy, swift, and undeniably purposeful, was the only warning he had. Jax didn't stop to look. He didn't have the luxury of time. His muscles screamed as he pushed himself harder, his breathing harsh and ragged in the thin atmosphere. Another howl. Closer now. He reached the outpost and ducked inside, quickly scanning the dim interior. His eyes locked on the equipment strewn about, electrical cables, a broken power generator, and half-empty crates of supplies. There was a momentary sense of panic, but Jax forced it down. Focus. Focus on what you know. He grabbed a cable and tore it loose from the wall, then turned to the power generator. If he could get it running again, he could create a temporary barrier, a field of electricity. It might buy him enough time to think of another way out. The hum of movement outside grew louder as the creatures surrounded the building. Jax felt the air grow colder, as though the very world had held its breath. They were closing in. Their scent, sharp, metallic, was almost suffocating now, and the sound of their claws on the ground filled his ears. He wasn't going to make it. He wasn't going to survive this. The thought crept into his mind uninvited, but he pushed it away with the sheer force of will. Not today. Not now. With a quick twist, he ignited the generator, and a series of sparks erupted from the broken wires. He pulled back, eyes narrowing as a crackling energy field began to form. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. It was enough to slow the creatures down, just long enough for him to think. To find a way out of this nightmare. His comm buzzed again, this time Lyra's voice filled with an almost frantic tone. Jax, what's your status? We're almost there. You're running out of time. He couldn't afford to waste another second. I'm buying time, Captain, Jax said, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding him. But I'm going to need more than reinforcements to survive this. I need a way to stop them for good. There was a long pause, and for a moment, Jax thought the transmission had cut out. But then Lyra's voice returned, colder this time. You're not alone, Jax. We've been tracking their movements for months. The hunters, they're not just predators. They're hunters of the highest order. The only way to stop them is to take out their nest. The transmission cut out again, but Jax knew what he had to do now. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for everyone. The energy field crackled to life, and the air around him hummed with power. Jax tightened his grip on his weapon, his mind already racing with plans, strategies. There was one thing he knew for certain, he wasn't going down without a fight. And as the first hunter emerged from the shadows, he was ready to face it head-on. The crackling hum of the energy field surrounded Jax like a thin veil of protection. He stood at the center of the room, the air around him electric with tension. The hunters were closing in, their eyes gleaming with hunger and malice, and he could feel their presence growing stronger, more tangible. Every movement, every step they took seemed to ripple through the air, pressing against him, suffocating him. They were like shadows, silent and fast, their forms only briefly visible before they vanished into the darkness again. Jax's heart beat hard against his ribs as he adjusted his grip on his weapon, the weight of it grounding him, steadying his mind. He couldn't allow fear to control him, not now, not when everything depended on his next move. Outside the perimeter of the energy field, the creatures were prowling, circling him. Their sharp, almost insectoid features flickered in the dim light, their twisted forms a grotesque parody of the creatures they had once been. They weren't just predators, they were relentless, perfect hunters, designed for one purpose, to track and kill. But Jax wasn't going to make it easy for them. His comm buzzed again, the faint sound of Lyra's voice cutting through the static. Jax, do you copy? We're almost there, but you need to get out of there. The hunters, they've taken the entire outpost. There's nothing left. You have to leave now. Jax gritted his teeth. I'm not running, Lyra. I'm ending this. I'm going after the nest. Lyra's voice crackled in frustration. Jax. But he cut her off, silencing the comm before she could say anything more. Time was short. He had no intention of surviving just to run again. No, the only way to stop this was to take the fight to them, get to the heart of their infestation and destroy it. The nest. The source. He didn't have a map. He didn't have a blueprint of the station. All he had were his instincts, and the few pieces of information he'd gathered in the past few hours. The outpost wasn't just a shelter or a mining facility, it was a breeding ground. The hunters had been using it as their lair, a place where they could grow their numbers in secret, away from the eyes of the outside world. That's why the miners had disappeared. They hadn't just been killed, they'd been turned. Altered. Jax's blood boiled. The thought of his comrades, his crew, being twisted into these things, losing their humanity, was enough to fuel his every action. His every breath. He had to stop this. He would stop it. The creatures outside the energy field were getting restless. Their low growls reverberated through the walls, mixing with the ever-present crackling of the barrier. They knew Jax was here. They knew he was their prey, but they couldn't get to him. Not yet. He stepped forward, his pulse steady, and pulled the power pack from the generator he'd just activated, his eyes scanning the layout of the room. The walls were covered with old mining tools and equipment, but he didn't need them. No, he needed something more, a spark, a chain reaction. Anything that could set the entire place ablaze. He couldn't take down the hunters one by one. They were too fast, too numerous. But if he could destroy the nest, he'd destroy the heart of the infestation. It would take them down. Taking a deep breath, Jax crouched next to a small console by the wall, a control panel for the facility's old air filtration system. He remembered seeing the vents and pipes earlier. The infrastructure was fragile, old, rotting away under years of neglect. Perfect. Fingers trembling but focused, he powered up the console. The ventilation system hummed to life, and Jax smirked. A simple plan. He wasn't going to fight these things head-on. He was going to starve them out. The moment the system powered up, the walls began to hum, a faint whirring sound reverberating beneath his feet. He activated the emergency purge protocol, overloading the filters and cutting off the oxygen supply to the lower levels. The vents began to hiss, and Jax could hear the sound of pressure building. This was it. The hunters wouldn't be able to survive without air, not for long. They would be forced to the surface, where they would suffocate. Starve. He stood up and turned, feeling the faint vibration of movement beneath the floor. His heartbeat quickened, and he could see the shadows of the creatures pressing closer to the barrier. The field crackled, but the hunters knew their time was running out. They were desperate. And desperate creatures made mistakes. Jax raised his gun and fired, the shots ringing out as they collided with the metal around the creatures. They howled, their twisted forms leaping toward the energy field, desperate to tear through the barrier. The creatures slammed against the invisible shield, their claws scraping against it, but Jax wasn't interested in them. He had no intention of waiting. He moved swiftly, ducking behind a pillar, his eyes scanning the darkened edges of the outpost. The nest had to be nearby, hidden somewhere beneath all this rubble. And then he saw it. A flicker of movement, something out of place, a shimmering presence beneath the collapsed ceiling. It wasn't just a nest, it was a hive. A central chamber, a place where the creatures had been incubating, a breeding ground. He knew this was it. The hunters weren't just invaders. They were something far worse. They were infectors, and they had laid their eggs, growing their army beneath the outpost's very foundation. Jax moved towards it, his hands still clutching his sidearm, his mind calculating every movement. He was so close now, the creatures still scrambling against the barrier, pushing harder, faster. There was no time to waste. With a final leap, Jax slid under a broken piece of debris and dove into the heart of the nest. His eyes widened as he saw the twisted larvae writhing inside cracked eggs, the walls lined with grotesque, malformed bodies. This was it. The core of their infestation. Jack stood up, not caring about the danger anymore, the desperation of the moment overriding everything. He pulled the detonator from his belt, a simple device, but effective, and pressed the button. Boom! The explosion rocked the entire outpost. The walls trembled, and the ground buckled beneath his feet as the nest ignited in a blinding flash of fire. The air was thick with smoke and ash as the tremors passed through the building, sending the creatures into a frenzy. They shrieked as their home burned, their numbers scattered, their strength broken. Jack staggered back as the explosion reverberated through the walls, dust choking him. But he didn't stop. He was still alive. He had done it. The hunters were no more. He climbed to his feet and made his way out of the crumbling structure, barely able to see through the smoke, but knowing his path. His comm unit buzzed again, and this time, Lyra's voice was full of relief. "Jax, you did it. You actually did it." He smiled weakly, feeling the exhaustion creeping into his bones. "It's over. For now." He paused for a moment, standing amidst the ruins of the outpost, watching the flames lick at the sky. It wasn't victory that he felt, but something more profound. Something that felt like survival. "Just another day at the office, Captain," he said, his voice filled with dry humor, before the comm clicked off. Jax looked up at the sky, the stars flickering beyond the smoke and destruction. He had faced impossible odds, but in the end, it was humanity's resilience, its ingenuity, and its will to survive that had seen him through. And as he took the first step toward his next challenge, he knew one thing for certain: they would never stop. But neither would he.